Kenja McCray is a humanities faculty member at Clayton State University, where she teaches history. Dr. McCray has also served as a visiting associate professor of history at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She holds a Ph.D. in history from Georgia State University and a BA from Spelman College. Her research focuses on the 20th century United States, African Americans, Africa and the diaspora, transnational histories, women, and leadership. Her work has appeared in the Journal of the Georgia Association of Historians, the 60s Journal, Indiana Magazine of History, and Social History. Dr. McCray's monography, Essential Soldiers, Women Activists, and Black Power Movement Leadership, is forthcoming in August of 2025. The book focuses on the unique organizing and advocacy style of female Pan-African nationalists during the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Everyone, please help me in welcoming Dr. Kenja McCray to the Georgia Press.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, please be careful of the cord.
Thank you.
I'm sure a better place to plug in.
Oh, I guess I could have kept time with my computer. So let's see how I do this. Easy. Thank you for having me. I'm going to share research from my forthcoming book, Essential Soldiers. And a lot of this information, because it's about the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement comes up in these women's stories, really as part of their biographies, their backstories, what I'm calling for today, their genealogies. This didn't make it into the book. I mean, unless everybody wanted to read a book that was almost 500 pages long. And as critics said, or reviewers, let's say reviewers said, felt like 2 books, right? So maybe this will be the next book. Probably it's going to be some articles, right? But just bear with me and we will get started. On a balmy summer day in Newark, New Jersey, Amina Baraka sat on the stoop of her home, recounting days spent as an activist and organizer during the Black Power movement. As the mild breeze blew through her silver hair, she discussed her time in the Committee for a Unified Newark, or CFUN, and in the Congress of African People, CAP. She spoke confidently and positively for the most part, remembering those days with fondness. Occasionally, though, disappointment tinged her story. The dismay was sometimes subtle. At other times, it blared louder than the sirens whizzing by the tree-lined street where she lived. Recalling details of the work that she and other women performed to help organize the 1972 National Black Political Convention, she punctuated her list with the following statement. We were there, but nobody, like James Baldwin's book, nobody knows our names. And that is haunting me and is the reason I'm giving this interview. Telling stories of the women activists who were in 𝘏𝑗𝑚-influenced Pan-African cultural nationalist organizations, making their names known, is in part what propels my work. Okay, so I just wanted to share that with you because I thought it was really compelling, and Amina Baraka, who is the second wife of poet and playwright and political activist Amiri Baraka, has that compelling poetic voice. She was an actress, and it it just sent shivers through my body when she said that, and I was like, "Ooh, people have to hear this." And I did not know much about her before I got into this research. I got into the research as part of a survey course on activism in the Black freedom struggle and social movements in Black history that I took with Dr. 𝘠𝘰𝘮𝘰𝘮𝘯 at Georgia State University. And I was feeling around trying to figure out what I was going to do my dissertation on. I knew I wanted to do research on Black women and the Black freedom struggle, right? We were studying the Black freedom struggle. Some people were calling understanding the Black freedom struggle as the long Black civil rights movement, the long civil rights movement. But some scholars were saying, that's a little bit lazy. You know, the civil rights movement had a distinct beginning and end. It was not a long civil rights movement. It was a long struggle that was made of different movements. So when you hear me say the long Black freedom struggle, that's the perspective I'm coming from. So I knew I wanted to work on the long Black freedom struggle. I had come from Clark Atlanta University. I did my master's there, where I studied with one of the speakers who will be on tomorrow, Vicki Crawford. And she writes on women in the civil rights movement. And she was a co-editor with one of my other professors, Dr. Jacqueline Rouse, about, like this groundbreaking work on women in the civil rights movement. So I felt, oh, they said everything there is to say about Black women in the civil rights movement or women in the civil rights movement. I don't know what to say. So when I took this class with Dr. 𝘠𝘰𝘮𝘰𝘮𝘯, I was interested in Black women and maybe Black power. We were reading essays. This is the early-ish 2000s. We were reading essays that were defining Black power as a distinct field of study in the Black freedom struggle. And I think get rid of this now. I'll come back to it. Developing timelines, really expressing that Black power becomes a distinct movement by the time of the Mississippi March Against Fear, when activists wind their way through that state to protest when James Meredith had tried to walk alone in 1966 to show that things had changed in the United States and there was nothing to fear. A Black man could walk through Mississippi from Memphis to Jackson by himself and nothing would happen to him. But not long after he had crossed into the state of Mississippi, after having left Memphis, he was blasted with a shotgun. A white supremacist had jumped out of the bushes and blasted him with a shotgun. So in this March Against Fear, many of the activists of the day took up his cause. It was several days long, and by the time that activists had gotten to Greenwood, they had permission to camp on the grounds of a school, but they were still arrested and told you can't camp here. Stokely Carmichael, this is a famous picture where he gets up and he says, I've been arrested over 20 times. I think he says 26 times. And in a majority Black town like Greenwood, this shouldn't be. If we have permission to camp, the white power structure shouldn't come by and say, you can't camp and put you in jail. And so what we want is Black power, particularly in majority Black spaces like this. We should be empowered. What we want is Black power. And the news media reported the crowd roared back Black power. And he and other members of Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, including Willie Ricks, said Black power. And the crowd roared back Black power. And it got louder, right? And this was a defining moment, right? It was different. The mood was different. Things changed. And so for about 10 more years to follow, the Black freedom struggle had a different tone, different iconography, different leadership, different aesthetics, right? And so we should look at it differently, study it differently. And if we look at the literature, often this era is looked at as the evil twin of the civil rights movement, who came in and kind of wrecked the civil rights movement and ran off all the good donors and scared the white people away. And that maybe we needed to take a deeper look, right? So I was like, this is interesting. So Dr. Umoja said, I said, but I still can't, I think I want to write on Panther women. I think I want to write on Panther women. But I can't think of, there's a book out and it's talking about Angela Davis and it's talking about Assata Shakur. I was of the generation, I was of the hip hop generation, and I was of the generation who, when you got to college, somebody pressed the autobiography of Assata Shakur in their hand. Right? I see people nodding. Yeah. So you had to read that, right? And so I read that, there are lots of autobiographies coming out. I was assigned Elaine Brown's autobiography. So there was some autobiographies of Black Panther women coming out. And I wasn't sure about that. And there were some things coming out about Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and women who were in that organization when it took a more militant turn, right? So I said, I don't know. And Dr. Umoja said, why don't you write about women in Kawaida? And I said, Kawalu. I hadn't heard of it. And he said, well, there's a book. Check out this book, Fighting for Us. There's a book on it. Check it out. And when I read it, I was like, oh, Kawaida. Okay, so I understand what you're saying. Kawaida. It was the philosophy, the larger philosophy that produced Kwanzaa. And I had begun celebrating Kwanzaa when I was in my first year at Spelman. And so I was familiar by the time I was in the PhD program with Kwanzaa, and it had become a regular part of my life. But I did not know, or maybe I hadn't paid attention when I was reading the books to this larger philosophy. And so I became very interested. So I started to read the literature. I did a literature review for my final project for this class. And so I read the literature, and the literature is, as I'm reading, it's coming down the pipeline, right? Well, this is the literature that's out at the time. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. This comes later. This is in the works. This is in the works. All of these are by men. And so the stuff that's coming down the pipeline starts to engage women. the women are part of the larger story of the organizations, or the, part of the men's stories about themselves. So I say, I have something to explore. So one of the things that I explore is what are the women doing in this evil, militant, right, part of the Black freedom struggle. And in particular, this part of the Black freedom struggle has a particularly bad reputation for masculinism, authoritarian, top-down leadership, strongmen leaders. So it's overlapping with the feminist movement. Why are women joining these organizations? I'm intrigued. So I want to talk with them. I'm fired up. So I start to interview women. Dr. Umoja starts to put me in touch with people who put me in touch with women who have been in these organizations. And so I see myself as writing up a study that is contributing to this larger body of work about women in Black power, 𝘭𝘭𝘵𝘳𝘭 organizations. And so 𝘭𝘭𝘵𝘮 is considered a cultural nationalist orientation. So basically within Black power, the Black power movement, although this is an oversimplification, it's an oversimplification. Many people, even some activists at the time, sort of divided Black power activism into the revolutionary nationalists like the Panthers, who are working toward an immediate revolution, an armed struggle that will overturn society as we know it and bring about a radical change that's led by the working class. And then cultural nationalists who want to bring about a cultural change. It's an oversimplification because many of the people who are labeled cultural nationalists will say, we want a revolutionary change too. And we do have a socialist sort of critique as well. But we have the idea that if you don't have a cultural change, then you'll just recreate the same issues that you had in society before. So you do need to draw on your ancestral African values to bring about a cultural change before there's any revolutionary structural change, any economic changes, all right? But remember I said I got assigned Elaine Brown's autobiography, and one of my first, I guess, experiences with the critique of the cultural nationalists was, it was ridiculed. She sort of ridiculed them and said, oh, well, the men dress in these outfits. They're supposed to look like African dashikis, but they look like maternity tops to me, that kind of thing. So I understand why this is considered a false dichotomy, but it's a shorthand, right? And so I still use the terminology cultural nationalists. So, right. So I say they are cultural nationalists and they are Pan-Africanist. So they also see and work toward connections that focus on the shared history, the shared struggles, and a shared destiny with people of African descent across the world. So Pan-African cultural nationalist organizations. So that's where Essential Soldiers, the book, the research for the book fits in. It contributes to the literature on women in Pan-African cultural nationalist organizations. So along came, oh, sorry, I keep clicking on that. Along came Remaking Black Power in 2017 by Ashley Farmer. So it's a first book that solely focuses on women in Black Power and how they transformed the era. And it has a couple of chapters that deal with women in cultural nationalist organizations. And recently, 𝘠𝘰𝘮𝘯𝘕 𝘠𝘰𝘮𝘯𝘕 has co-authored a biography of Deborah Jones, or an autobiography. It's a memoir, I guess it's a memoir, of Deborah Jones, who was a woman in the US organization. So those are two that solely focus on women. Mine, a lot of these look at women in these organizations. Ashley Farmer looks at women in several cultural nationalist organizations, but people point out the women's leadership, but nobody codifies it. And all of these really talk about the leadership models in Black Power organizations and Black Power cultural nationalism. Again, pointing out the models of authoritarianism, top-down leadership. But no one goes so far as to say what the women did was sort of different. It was unique. And here's how. And I found that to be problematic because the suggestion is that there's only one model that comes out of Black Power leadership. It's authoritarian, it's male dominated. It gets a shorthand in popular culture for a while as a hashtag. Black Power is for Black men. So that doesn't help this larger narrative that Black Power is this evil twin that wrecked the civil rights movement. So I'm not trying to say that Black Power leadership was not authoritarian. There were authoritarian models of leadership. There were authoritarian leaders. But as women who joined organizations, the organizations that I looked at, navigated this reality, they also demonstrated leadership models. And those leadership models were often very different from those of the men. And these are also Black Power leadership legacies. They were often remembered as essential leaders, and they often thought of themselves as just doing what needed to be done, filling in where they were needed. More than once, different women in different groups who really didn't know each other self-identified as soldiers. Once, one woman saying they were an essential soldier, and so that's where I came up with the name of the book. And then with the pictures, the top picture is from a collection of pictures from a Black photographer named T. Harris in Pittsburgh. He would just photograph Black Pittsburgh. And when I interviewed one of the women who was in the Congress of African People Pittsburgh chapter, and I said, do you have pictures? And she was like, no, not really. I have an old pen and, she said, but look at the Teenie Harris collection. Teenie Harris was always going around taking pictures. So I looked through that collection, and lo and behold, I found this picture. And she's in the center. Her name is Tominika Howes, I'm sorry. And she's standing in front of the Pittsburgh Congress of African Peoples clinic. So they, for a while, ran a drug rehabilitation center. And she and other women who were a part of Congress of African People Pittsburgh were doing a fundraiser. And it's a very interesting picture. I actually now in hindsight should have made a bigger, put a bigger version of it here. But I wanted to put this on the cover because it's just so emblematic of what I wanted to convey about the women's leadership. One, they're working, their heads are down. And a lot of the work that they did, because the women in cultural nationalist organizations often filled very feminized roles, because a part of what they did in reclaiming what they saw as tradition was to, quote unquote, return to traditional, in quotes, roles as they understood them. So they did a lot of caregiving for children, a lot of food preparation, things like that. So you see them performing those roles a lot. And so they're fundraising here. And this woman has, when I zoomed in, a baby here. I thought it was a doll, but when I looked closely, this is a baby here. And then another in a stroller. I don't know if it's her baby. Just one second. I don't know if it's her baby or if she's babysitting for someone else, but it's just so emblematic of the type of work that the women did to keep these organizations running and to keep their missions moving forward. Yes, ma'am.
I just was gonna say, I'm not sure if you're pointing to something, but we can't see.
Oh, you can, okay, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, because I'm just moving this cursor. But I was pointing here to the woman. So, yeah, on the table with the blanket. Yeah. Yeah, that's a baby in front of her. And then I was pointing to the baby with the stroller. Yeah. Thank you. But I know you were waiting to see the word 𝘏𝑗𝑚, so I made sure I wrote it up there. So that's 𝘏𝑗𝑚. And it was a Kiswahili or Swahili word. Swahili is a language spoken in East and Central Africa. And it was selected because, remember, this is pre-DNA, the human genome had not been fully mapped. So the idea was that it was spoken by a number of people. It wasn't just specific to one particular ethnic group. So it symbolized unity across ethnic groups, the possibility at least of unity across ethnic groups. And this is what African descended people in the diaspora, African Americans, needed, because the legacy of slavery meant that African Americans, diasporic Africans, were quite diverse in terms of their heritage, ethnic heritage from Africa. And it really meant something ordinary in Swahili, but it was interpreted to mean tradition and reason in the context of 𝘏𝑗𝑚 organizations. And so that meant basically go back and reclaim your traditions and hold on to them within reason. Within reason meant whatever's reasonable within a modern context. Okay, so the organizations that I looked at were us. They were located in California. The Committee for Unified Newark and New Jersey, and the Congress of African People, which was an umbrella organization that was made up of a lot of different local organizations, but was headquartered in Newark through 𝘬𝑓und. The East organization in Brooklyn, New York, and 𝘠𝘰𝘮𝑗 in New Orleans. Like I said, my first why was, why did these women join? But eventually, my central question was, what is a leader? And, so what constitutes leadership? Why do people wield the power to lead? Do they lead because people fear them? Do they lead because they have a certain kind of power, charisma? Or are they seen as leaders because they say, how can I help? And that's less common. Generally, in our society, we define leadership in one of these the first ways. And we don't as much, even though it's an ideal, right? But we don't, as readily define leaders as the person who showed up and said, how can I help? How can I serve? But actually, it was people, when I presented my research in spaces like this during Q&A, who actually were in the field of leadership studies, who said, I hear a lot of leaders there. And I was like, what, huh? What? And so I had to go and read about servant leadership. Robert Greenleaf's servant leadership is what shaped the foundation of my understanding of these women as leaders. And then I could begin to hear how people who maybe have been in their work groups, or people who they trained, young people who they supervised when I interviewed them, or when somebody else interviewed them and I read the transcripts from the interview, actually even had mentally elected them, right, informally elected them to leadership positions, even when you look at the written record and it shows someone else is a leader on paper. And so what I bring to the table is that one of the changes in the genealogies of the Black freedom struggle that I would like to assert is that in this characterization of Black power leadership, and its relationship to the civil rights movement, let's rethink this focus on the best known figures, these charismatic, cult of personality, top-down leaders. So yes, Maulana Karenga, he's known as the sole progenitor of Kwanzaa. And that's not to take that away from him, but let's broaden the story, right, of Kwanzaa, and how not only it was begun, and there are some other documented stories about how it was much more communally started and propagated. And how leadership has both its authoritarian, charismatic, top-down, autocratic components, but also the way the rank and file in these organizations navigated that shows elements of other styles of leadership, like servant leadership. Amiri Baraka is also one of the better known leaders from the Black Power movement. He writes himself in his autobiography and in other documents, and so does Maulana Karenga, that there were mistakes made with the leadership. And Baraka says there was a cult of personality kind of leadership that was built around him, and that was not the healthiest. So the leadership, the servant leadership style that I found that the women in Qaeda influenced organizations developed was based on the principles of Blackness. So the principles of Blackness, as we know them, became the principles of Kwanzaa. This is a picture from Ahidiyana's Work Study Center, where the children are holding up the principles. Umoja, Kujitagulia, Ujima, Ujima, Nia, Kuumba, and Imani. They mean unity, self-determination, collective work and responsibility, familyhood and cooperative economics, purpose, creativity, and faith. In my interviews, I did, my research was based on textual archival work, right? And on oral histories. So some of the oral histories were archived, and many of them, I conducted about 30 on my own and recorded them. One of the main things that stood out to me in the oral histories that I performed was that there's this shadow eighth principle, which was called 𝘏𝑗𝑠𝑖. So there was a collective work and responsibility, ujima, and then people talked about 𝘏𝑗𝑠𝑖 a lot, and they would even say 𝘏𝑗𝑠𝑖 was the blackest of all the Black principles of Blackness. And so I had to, after a while, ask, like, how is that different from ujima? And the way they talked about 𝘏𝑗𝑠𝑖, they meant it to mean protracted struggle, long, hard struggle, and almost, even though they were loath to talk about individualism, there between the lines was like, and it's, you know, it's you putting in the work as an individual. You can't hide behind, oh yeah, you know, I showed up in the group, and you really didn't do much work. You did a lot of talking. You told everybody else, oh, go over there, you know, yeah. And so they would say, yeah, you know, a lot of people do a lot of talking, but 𝘏𝑗𝑠𝑖 is the blackest of them all. So that service, that the work that the activists felt had to be put in to achieve Black liberation was at the forefront of a lot of what they did and a lot of their reasoning for why they did it. And so I named their particular brand of leadership, servant leadership or service leadership, 𝘏𝑗𝑠𝑖 leadership. I have to take my glasses off to make sure I'm doing okay with time. And so in a lot of the pictures that I could find, you saw women in particular working. It was actually, when you think about the cover, the lady at the bottom talking at the podium, you saw very little of that. And that was out of the time frame I studied. That was from the early 1990s. And I looked at 1965 until 1986, I think. So when I could find pictures, women were always working. This is Ahidiana. 𝘕𝘭𝘴𝘰𝘳𝘨 Salam is the adult in the picture. She was the wife of, if you're familiar with poetry, New Orleans poetry, 𝘭𝘪𝘢𝘭 Salam, or like acting and playwright. He was a local playwright. You found work embedded in a lot of their language, titling. So the name of the Ahidiana school was Ahidiana Work Study Center, and their curriculum was called the Rasa Kazi, or Work and Study. And, in the curriculum was our people, children, our people are always working. And so I defined Kazi leaders as people who organized, directed, and sustained Black freedom struggle programs and institutions. And Kazi leadership was work-centered, and it drew on the principles of Kazi and Ujima to guide the activist service. So why did they serve? Why did they, that answered that question. Why did these women get into this? They felt they were guided to. They felt they were guided to serve. And so in cases where I would be like, well, why would you agree? Like, so you saw that the organization was guided by, some people who were pushing multiple, this idea that guys should have multiple wives, but you didn't like that. But why did you keep going? Well, I thought that that's what we needed to bring about change, so I did it. But then when I got in there, I was like, oh no, so I tried to work for something different, right? Like that work and that service guided a lot of what they did. Kazi leadership was group-centered. So like I said, people were loath to talk about, I did this for me. I wanted to be a leader because I wanted to elevate myself. That wasn't it. It was I thought that the community needed this. We needed this. Drugs were a problem in the community. We needed a place so we got up early. We sacrificed our Saturdays. Our children needed. And it was what made it different from Greenleaf's servant leadership or any old service leadership was it was grounded in African-centered values. So the study part of work and study, people usually started with, well, what can we find? Let's go to the library. What can we find about, let's talk to someone that we know who's in exile from South Africa about African customs. What can we find out that's ancestral that can guide us? In this picture, this is from the organization US, and this is showing a change. Like I said, in particular, the US organization was known to be quite male-dominated. And then when you read, you'll see that women's resistance to that male dominance caused the leadership to at least somewhat rethink those positions. And so the reconstituted organization would have make an effort to at least include some more women's leadership. And so here you see one of the women who I interviewed, 𝘭𝘭𝘴𝘰𝘭𝘥𝘪𝘎 performing leadership work with the National US Committee. And then another woman who I interviewed, Maisha Ngoza, she was in Philadelphia Congress of African People. This is Amina Baraka from I think 1969 or 1970. We won't have time to look at this. I talk about a bit about change over time in the book, but you hear her talking about how, women must be submissive and go back to our traditional roles of inspiring our men and taking care of the home and the children. And then you can observe her caucusing with other women and writing in newspapers and studying and saying, wait a minute, no. And she really spearheads the effort to push back against those submissive gender roles in Congress of African People. So part of their service and leadership, women, as part of their service and leadership, I claim that women really pushed back against that. And Ashley Farmer says they actually remade Black power. So we shouldn't, one of the things that I want to say about the genealogies, right, of Black power is that we shouldn't leave it at, oh, they're just these, top-down authoritarian male leaders, but that there are these women leaders, Kazi leaders, servant leaders who really did a lot to change those leadership roles. I'm not gonna play that.
Okay.
Yes.
Just a quick question. You covering you said your years 1965 to
87.
87. Anything in your research about the organization, the MOVE, that was in Philadelphia that were bombed?
I didn't do MOVE. No, they weren't. They weren't a 𝘏𝘰𝘮𝘬 influenced organization. They weren't a 𝘏𝘰𝘮 organization. They weren't a part of Congress of African People or anything like that. But I'm familiar with MOVE. And I was in workshops with people who focused on MOVE, but I didn't do MOVE.
Okay.
Mhm.
Because a lot of people don't even know about MOVE too.
Oh, yeah, I know about MOVE. Yeah.
And I don't know everything. I just remember from the bombs would drop.
Yeah. So I just want to skip forward. One question that came up a lot and one that I saw in pop culture references was that, oh, well, Black power women, they kind of came out of nowhere. Like they didn't, who were their precedents? And while some of the precedent for or the template for the women that I studied came from Black nationalism, older forms of Black nationalism, let's just say like the Universal Negro Improvement Association, 𝘏𝑃𝑔𝘮𝑖tes, things like that. Many of the women really charted their path to Black power through the civil rights movement. So I will give you an example, 𝘍𝘪𝘊𝑃𝑔𝘮𝑖𝑏𝑟𝑜, who I pointed out before, who actually was a co-chair of the US organization in the 1980s. She's there in the middle of this picture. That's her in college. I found her in a yearbook. Really credited, one, her childhood in the NAACP in Minnesota, St. Paul, Minnesota. Her aunt and uncle would make sure she and her sister and brother went to the NAACP on a regular basis in Minnesota. They had come from Mississippi, migrated from Mississippi, and they still encountered discrimination in Minnesota. She said they would often have the same kind of trouble getting served at Woolworth in St. Paul, right? And so her aunt and uncle said, we're going to the NAACP. I'm going to make sure you all have membership. And that really put her on the path toward always staying active as she called it a race woman. And a lot of her activism, she said she modeled after Mary McLeod Bethune. And she stayed an active member. I could confirm this in newspaper articles with the National Council of Negro Women at the same time as she did her work with us, the US organization. And when she was a chairperson, she would often overlap those activities, especially with fundraising. If you're unfamiliar, NCNW is an organization that was founded by Mary McLeod Bethune. Nowadays, it's much more common. I did look at the National African American Museum's website. It's much more common, but still not in, I think, our regular discourse, a part of our regular discourse, to really put forward the idea that while not all, many Black Power activists did not make a big difference between their Black Power work and what we would categorize as civil rights work. So they might say what we need is Black Power, but then they might also be involved in voter registration. They might also be involved in food cooperatives. So I said we would come back to the issue of foodways. Jennifer Jensen Wallach writes about the Black nationalist foodways moment, right? And if, I guess, think the Nation of Islam, think Muhammad Ali, think no pork on my plate, right? You know, there's a turn, right? Think Dick Gregory, you know, like, so Black nationalist foodways would critique sometimes what they consider to be the slave diet, and advocate for a healthier, what they saw as a healthier diet. And many of the people in 𝘐𝑲𝑡ℎ influenced organizations would also do that. And so part of what they saw as their community work would be modeling and introducing healthier foodways. So this pictured in the head wraps are women who were in the East organization in Brooklyn, New York. And they were headquartered in Bedford-Stuyvesant. And, you know, they had what they called a center for edutainment. And so they would have music at night, and many, what I think are luminaries would come through, like Pharoah Sanders. And like I said, I'm part of the hip hop generation. So the X-Clan would come through, and, you know, and they would play it at the East, and the women would cook and serve food, but it had to be healthier food. So they had recipes that they called like 𝘐𝑲𝑡ℎ rice, which was rice and vegetables. And what they said was they had trouble in Bed-Stuy, do or die, getting fresh vegetables. And so they had a cooperative way of going out, you know, to areas where fresh vegetables were grown, you know, pooling money together and bringing them in. And they didn't want to just get fresh vegetables for the members of the East, but for whoever wanted to come to the club, right, the edutainment, to hear the edutainment. And they actually started a co-op, Kununu Ana, where you could, you know, come and buy if you were in the neighborhood. And they felt that was a sort of liberatory thing for them to do. And they drew on traditions like that of Fannie Lou Hamer. And if you look Fannie Lou Hamer up, she had a co-op, and she had a pig bank in Mississippi that helped people who needed to start farms so they could eat in the Mississippi Delta. And they knew that they were building on things that Fannie Lou Hamer did, consciously knew that. So they didn't separate and say, well, she was civil rights, you know, and so Fannie Lou Hamer was not. No, they didn't think of them as separate things to do. And I want to say that it becomes, I think, dangerous if we throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, okay, well, that was the evil twin that wrecked the civil rights movement. We have a lot to learn from what people were doing in this Black Power movement, because I see people are frenzied, like, we're boycotting. Well, that's, you know, you can't say boycott this organization and that corporation, because some people cannot get, you know, to some other place. They only can go to this place, which is nearby. Okay, well, look to the past so we can move forward to the future, because these women were organizing in Bed-Stuy, do or die, to get fresh food. Whether you agree with the diet or not, they were finding ways to organize in the most dire of circumstances. And they set a template that was based on some other template that we can learn from today. And those are the genealogies that I think we should pay more attention to as we move forward. I'll stop there. Any questions?
I just want to throw something in. You mentioned 𝘰𝘭𝘴𝘰𝘭𝘏 Shakur.
I did.
And I had a chance to meet her daughter and her aunt that defended her in court. So
Oh.
that was, I have a picture of her daughter holding my daughter. It was really nice.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
exciting. What was the
That
aunt's
was,
name?
that was in the early 90s.
Mhm.
We used to do a session with Gary Bird at the Apollo Theater
Mhm.
every Thursday where I met straight on and those people come up. So
Nice.
It was really nice.
Yeah.
Her book is awesome. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
I really appreciate your work. Actually, right now, I'm working with an organization. We call ourselves the Southwest Georgia Project, the
Mhm.
kids. My mother was a veteran of the Southwest Georgia movement, you know, Charles Sherrod, Luther Harris, Bernice Reagan, all of these people. Actually, Rutha, who's 84, is still a part of this organization, as well as Shirley Sherrod. And what we're trying to do, they're saying that the story is not really being told, even though we have an entire museum in Albany, that's not the story. So we're trying to collect their stories, even though we know other organizations, you know, the ARPs, the Library of Congress is sharing getting their oral history. They're saying that's not the story. So we've been doing, I like that you said places and stuff. Civil sites is the next, that civil sites. We're trying to create a kind of a repository of this is the true movement of the South. Charles Sherrod, and my mother always says organize. So when you talked about leaders, in the civil rights movement, it would seem like she would say the person who knew how to organize. She would always say that word. She still says it today, organize, the person who was able to do that. But I'm trying to say the Southwest Georgia Project was in, this America's era kind of a co-op. And it kind of ran into what you're saying, the Black Power movement. So in Georgia, it was supposed to be the self-sustaining community, and the women all, women, men, they're all at the table. The woman who kept the finances, my aunt, she was, it was equal. There was some equality there. I'm trying to say, in terms of the Black Power movement, like in these places in the rural South, it just doesn't seem to have taken on. With that, I'm just trying to ask that question. Do you see that it's taken on kind of some force? Was it able to kind of have traction? Because like I said, in that Southwest Georgia movement, Southwest Georgia Project, that we are documenting that history, that was the quote unquote second stage of the civil rights movement, where Charles Sherrod, where he was no longer organizing with the civil rights movement per se, but he was organizing with the self-sustaining community. And they were still doing voters registration. They were still doing, CB King they were still doing cases and things like that of discrimination. But do you see that as the case in the rural South, that it just kind of just didn't, for some particular reason, maybe whatever, the culture of that area, the rampant discrimination, or what, did you see that taking it root there?
So yes and no. Okay, so I'll go with the no first. No, it did not look exactly like it looked in the urban areas.
Gotcha.
Okay. Yes, though, when we break down what the constituent elements of Black Power were. So when you're talking about a self-sustaining community, self-determination, that was a key element of Black Power. And Russell Rickford, who wrote one of the books, the book about education, is now writing about the land question, he calls it, in Black Power, which was a central element of Black nationalism and Black power. That I think maybe we don't look at enough. And I just, a chapter just came out in a book the book is specifically about African traditional religions, specifically Ifa. And it's co-authored I co-authored it with my colleague, Antoinette Brownway. And we engage Rickford's work because he's saying with the East, they started saying, we can't grow food and all this concrete in Brooklyn. So one of their projects, at first they go down to Guyana. But we know the story of Guyana, right? When you think of Jim Jones, right? It's not a stable, politically it's not a stable place to put down roots. So people who are urban focused in Black power are grappling with this issue of food sovereignty and land ownership. We're urban focused in Black power. But the problem is most of our people had become urban dwellers by that point. Most people in the United States were urban dwellers, right? So you had a few groups who are like, well, we have to procure control over land. So then you have the Nation of Islam getting swathes of farmland, right? You have the Republic of New Africa. And then for us, this chapter, you have people who are part of African traditional religions, like those who found 𝘏𝘀𝘭𝘏𝘮𝘰 village in South Carolina. And so there is a rural element of Soul City, Floyd McKissick, right? And so there's a rural element that focuses on self-determination and self-sustaining communities that needs to be studied. Because it's still unfolding. I don't know if I was unclear that, I'm getting into this thing, but this Black power as its own, area of study is still unfolding. So I think you have the answers, and your work is going to help us flesh out what was happening in the rural South with Black power and how it looks different than the cities. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense. The only way I was able to make my mother went to New York after she left the movement and married a Black Panther and had my sister. So that's why I was able to keep the timeline consistent. And then she came back and worked with the Southwest Georgia Project for $10 a week. So that's how I was able to keep the timeline and say, okay, they were doing the same thing.
Right. And all this stuff is in my head. I'm trying not to drop anything or let it come out too fast. But the Black Panther symbol is from where?
Mississippi.
Lowndes County, Alabama. Bloody Lowndes. Yeah, so it's the rural and the urban, they overlap a lot. That's all I can say. Yeah.
And I guess this is just a question for my further reference, because you're speaking of civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. I was born and raised in Mississippi. To me, those two things commingle into the same thing. And I would, if there's a difference that I'm not seeing, if you can reference books or something I can read about. But yeah, I mean, growing from there, they're the same things. The civil rights, they were all talking about, we as Black people got to get together and survive and do the great thing. They might have to have a different way of doing it, but I just don't necessarily separate them into two different, you're talking about food and whatever. I came from an environment where we moved from the rural area to Vicksburg, which was considered a big town. But the people in the rural area had the land and the crops, and they always would call out my mom and my dad saying, okay, the peas, the corn, or whatever is ready. Y'all come on down here and get y'all some. So we were all doing the same things, but in different ways. So when I saw the Panthers, I just thought they was just out here trying to help Black people, just like the civil rights, like us, civil rights. So I don't necessarily see the goals as being different, how you went about getting those goals. Your goals were the same, but your methods to getting those goals may have been different. So is there something like that'll tell me what, in a discussion like this, so what are we really talking about in the difference between the Black Power movement and the civil rights movements? And one other thing, women just work, whatever movement you was in, you worked for it. You weren't out there on the stage saying, Black Power, do this. You were back there working, getting the foods ready, taking care of the children, making the announcements to people, talking to the people over the next day. We just work.
Agreed. So I think we're saying the same thing.
Yes.
But the fork in the road part is more theoretical. So the article that I think was definitive was, for me, was The Long Civil Rights Movement as Vampire. The Long Civil Rights Movement as Vampire by last name 𝘠𝘰𝘭𝘴, CHA, I think there's a hyphen, JUA, and Lang, LANG. And then there's I think that's a starting place. Let's just say that, and we can talk on the side if you want more. That's the one where the authors say, it's just theoretically lazy to lump them both together because they have different leadership and different funding sources and different icons. And sometimes the leaders are criticizing each other. And at odds. Yeah, so. And then, yeah. The women, I think the only one of the main issues with just accepting that the women just worked is that they get lost to history. So an example would be The Defeat of Black Power is a book that I read, The Defeat of Black Power. It's a really good book. It's about the political defeat of the Black Power movement. So it focuses on political Black power. So getting Black elected officials elected and sustaining them in office, and particularly in majority Black spaces. And how it happened, historically, and then how this, right, but the thing is, not just that it's taken away, but that we get representational politics that replace it. So you still have Black officials, but their agenda is co-opted. So it's good, but the women who are working, the women like Amina Baraka in that book, they're mentioned, and the author says they work really hard, but they just become faceless and nameless, even though they have a name and faces, even in the record. So yeah, we can do better than that. And that's that. I don't want to take away our whole break. Thank you.